guys, welcome to part 2 of this 2-part tutorial. Today we're going to be adding ivy and moss to the building and floors. We'll work on the lighting, we'll export everything to After Effects, and then we'll do our compositing inside of After Effects. So let's jump right in and get started. Let's go into our preview mode though, so we're not stressing the processor. But we want to select this main mesh, hit J, and hit ivy. And for me, this is a little bit too much now. I'm going to take these pieces of ivy and I'm just going to move them out of the way. Click on the ivy itself, and then we'll go into modifiers. And then we have all the different options. We also have it here. I want to increase the height, increase the loops, because if we decrease the loops, you can see the pattern. So we don't want to do that. I like to increase the loops. So let's go with like 15. So it's really dense. So let's say 16. And then I'm just going to knock down the density to maybe 35. The one thing you don't want to do is just, do something like this where you're just covering the entire building, because then you can kind of see the pattern there and it just looks weird. So what I like to do is knock down the density, but then duplicate, but vary it up a little bit. 35, resolution 6, height, and you can bring that down just a little bit, play with the radius. And then one of the things I actually like doing is increasing the resolution for the grid. Now you can kind of see that that's a very distinct grid pattern. So I'm just going to knock that down, but increase the radius here, play with the resolution just a little bit, maybe 40. Then we can select this, Shift D to duplicate, and bring it over, and Shift D again. What we want to do is actually overlap a lot of these things so that we're not getting that same pattern. So it looks a little bit more random, but I'm going to select these guides and just hide them. And we're going to go into cycles and see what this looks like now. Okay, so that's a lot of ivy. So this is where you just play around with the density and the resolution and the position in order to get a base layer that's not too dense but not too sparse, because we're going to be adding more layers on top of this. But basically the short version is you just want to kind of set a random base layer so you have something to build off of. That's a pretty good base scatter, I think. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to add more ivy systems here. So I'll select the mesh, J, and then add more ivy here. Select that, go into it, and I'm just going to increase the height and decrease the density. So density will probably just start with 30. I'm just going to move this over so we can add sort of this stringy ivy hanging there. Looks a little weird because it's not joined in all places, so we have to increase the density until we get something that actually works. But one of the things that we can do is actually play with the gravity here, so it kind of droops. And that's looking really good. Now, I think one of the things that we need to add is some of the floors here. So I'm just going to create a new cube, move it over. I'm going to scale it down on the Z-axis and then scale it up and then move it into place here. So that's looking pretty good, but it is definitely too thick. So I scale on the Z-axis, GX. So we'll just line it up to where it's almost intersecting with the other mesh here, but not coming out the front. All right. And I'm going to move this up to align it with where the floors would be. So if we go into camera view, it probably helps to do this there. Select a lot of our ivy here and just hide it. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to duplicate this and just move it up, but we're going to put this as the ceiling here, probably roughly somewhere around there. And this floor, I'm going to move it up just a little bit so we see more of it. I'm also going to duplicate this and drop this down here and line this up with the floor that's down here. So we'll probably need another one. So Shift D, down, drop this floor down here, G, Y. I'm just going to move it over because I don't want to see it popping out over here. I think we should be set here for that, yeah. So I'm just going to add a concrete texture to these. So let's go into shading. Let's do a rough wall, export this to Blender. All right, so it was exported successfully. We'll just switch the material here. That's looking good. And then we can just copy this cube over to our other Blender project so that we can import this. So we'll just copy that over. And I'm just going to move this off screen. X. And I'm going to select these floors here. And we'll select our rough concrete texture. Yeah, so one of the things is that we're getting some stretching here on the edges. So let's go into UV editing and We'll take this box and we'll just cube projection. So we'll just unwrap it that way. And now you can see we have concrete texture over here. One of the things I'm noticing is that it's just very big. So what we'll do is we'll select all the faces and we'll just scale this up so that it shrinks it down. That's looking pretty good. And then we can see that we have that texture there. We're going to have to do that for the rest of these as well. So now we're going to have to cut our floors as well. So we're going to go into our cut tools. So we'll just line this up here. I want to select the top layer, hit draw cutter. I want to start it out here so that you can see the cut, because when we look at it from the view, we're going to see around there. So I want to kind of line that up. So let's just line it up with the edge here, but go over just a little bit more. I'm just going to draw this cutter in here and come out that way. I'll tab out of edit mode. I'll hit mesh cutter, and I think, yeah, we have to move this up. For whatever reason, it didn't kind of work. So strength, I'm going to lower it to like 0.65 and hit update. Let's go with 0.5, and I'll do this and I'll hit cut, and we can kind of just move that out of the way. So that's cool. I'm just going to delete that piece, and then we're going to do the same thing for this down here. So this is good because when we go into the camera view, we can see the damage on the roof piece there. So that's good. And then we want to do the same for the floor below it. Hit 7 to go to the top view. I'm going to do draw cutter, and we're just going to draw a cut right in there. Tab out of it, mesh cutter. Let's see if it lines up. It did not. So we'll have to bring that in. Let's look at it from the camera view. So I think right here is where we want to place it. And we'll select the mesh we want to cut and just hit cut. Select this, GX, move that out, go into camera view, and we can see that we have the floor damage right there. So we'll just get rid of this piece because we don't need it. I'll select this, I'll go into our materials, and we have this noisy cutter texture. If we go into shading, we can kind of see that checker texture. So I want to keep that. So let's just add another material here, but we'll just do the rough concrete. So we'll select this, hit select so that we're selecting only these faces, and then we'll select our rough concrete and hit assign, tab out, and so that's looking pretty awesome. We want to do the same thing for this layer here. Go into edit mode, tab into it. You'll see that those faces are selected. I'll just add a new material, and we'll go scroll down to rough concrete and hit assign. Click off of it. You can see that that's in there. So when we go into the camera view, we can see that there's a lot of texture there. So that's looking awesome. One of the things that I do want to do is add moss. So before I add the moss, I'm just going to select these layers, hit Control A, and apply the scale. I'm going to do that for each one of the floors. And then if we go back into the shading mode, I can just take that previous moss group node that we used on the face of the building and apply that to the floors. So let's see. There we go. Now, I don't know how much we're going to see of that in the camera here. Not a lot. So let's play around with the scale, and let's make it dry. There we go. But that's actually pretty good. We could actually see the moss there. So I'm just going to leave that. So let's enable all the ivy that I disabled. And I also want to bring back the background image so we can see what this looks like with the background image. And we get a little bit of a sense of what it's going to look like in the final composite. Maybe I'll just pull this down a little bit. And we'll select this. I want to show the guide because one of the things I want to do is I actually want to take this. I want to duplicate it and move it over here. And I moved it there, and I'm using the spiral tool because I want to see the ivy kind of creep into the crevices that we created there. So we kind of created like a hole where the balcony is. So I just want the ivy to kind of creep into there, wrap around the corners, just so it has a little bit more depth to it. And it actually looks like it's wrapping around the building. And one of the things I'm noticing is that the leaves are kind of big. So I'm going to go into, for this one in particular, I'll play with the size here. So ivy scale, I'll just do like 0.7. And same for this one, 0.7. You know what? Let's go with 0.85. Okay, so let's just preview this and see what happens. I think this is looking pretty good. I think this bit of ivy here, so ivy density, we could probably knock that up to 25. Go with 30 for that one. Maybe play with the resolution here too. It's 40, let's do 45. And then density 35. I think that's looking pretty good. This we're getting a little like weirdness here, so I'm going to change the loop number and the height, and I'm just going to move it down. See what that looks like. Yeah, that's cool. And so I'm really liking the fact that we're seeing a lot of these broken windows, and it looks like the ivy is kind of maybe moving into them. So I'm actually going to push this in just so we get a little bit of something different. And then here you see like the broken window here. This light, I actually want to switch this to a spotlight. If we look at these trees in the background, we kind of maybe want to match what's going on there with the lighting. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to set up the spotlight. So let's just move it over here. We'll make it a spot and we'll point it at that area. The one thing is that it's only set to 1,000. So let's set it to 5,000 and see what that looks like. Hopefully we can imitate what's going on with the sun. And we're going to have to switch the color a little bit too. So we're going to make it sort of like this orange, a reddish orange, and then I'll just pull back on the saturation. 10,000. We'll increase the radius to 150,000. All right, that's too strong, but that's getting there. So I want to overdo it so that I can kind of come back later and fix it. So I think that's looking pretty good. Let's see. I just want to bring this up and then just redirect that. Yeah, so that's pretty awesome. We're going to pull back on the saturation here and maybe swing it around just a little bit more to the red. And we'll do 20,000. Let's see here. Maybe the gravity is a little too strong here, so I'll do 0.8. So it's actually, yeah. I feel like I'm blocking, especially with this section here, I'm blocking too much of that. So let's just fix that before we start rendering here. Change the radius. I think the height as well. So we're not blocking any of this here and we can see it. So I'm going to hit F12. Let's see what this looks like. I just duplicated one of these spirals and I added just this little bit here because I felt like there was a little bit missing. By going in and hide that, I just felt like from the camera view, this part over here was a little sparse. With that added in, it kind of fills in this area. And now it makes more sense that there's ivy up here because this seems like it's the growth leading up to this. That just kind of fills in that gap there. I'm really happy with the way this is looking. I just want to go over to our render passes here. Make sure that we have combined, Z, mist, and shadow and ambient occlusion. I think we're really only going to use the combined, to be honest, because the depth of field isn't really that shallow. And I'm just going to do a crypto matte for the object and the material. This is all probably overkill because I really think that once I drop it in, I'm really just going to need the combined, but let's just do it anyway. So with that all set, I'm just going to go over here to our render settings, make sure we're on OpenEXR MultiLayer, RGB alpha, full float 32-bit, and this is looking good. Pick where we want to render this. So let's go to our project, side building destruction, renders, Blender, tutorial, version 1. And we're all set, so let's save and hit render. Okay, so here is our final render. If you scroll through here, if you hit combined, you can actually view the different passes. So we have ambient occlusion, we have our mist pass, we have the windows, the reflection. So we have all our passes in there. So I'm just going to save this by going to image, save as, and make sure we're on MultiLayer OpenEXR, RGB alpha, full float. You can do half, but I just prefer to do full. So I have full 32-bit, and we'll go to our renders folder, go to Blender, and I'm just going to name this tutorial, and this is version 1 of the tutorial render. So hit save as, and we are all set. So now we can just bring this into After Effects. So here we are in After Effects. I'm going to go and grab our tutorial render and bring it in. Now, the first thing you're going to notice is when you click on it, you're not seeing anything. That's because we actually have to extract what channel we want to view. If we just take this and drop it into its own comp, we can apply the 3D channel. We go to extractor, click on layers, and you can see we have all our passes here. So we'll just click on combined. So I'll just click on the transparency grid so we can see what's going on. And this is not displaying properly because we have to linearize the workspace. I've noticed that when you work in 3ds Max, you don't always have to do this. But for Blender, if you have different render passes, I usually find that you have to do this for the file. At least that's my experience with it so far. So now this is displaying properly, and we can pick whatever pass we want. Mist, ambient occlusion, combined, all that stuff. So one of the problems with rendering a multi-pass OpenEXR out of Blender and bringing that into After Effects is that it gets pretty heavy. And you can see here that just the one combined pass and the alpha is 27 megabytes. But as we start adding more passes, it now becomes 83 megabytes. And now if we have a lot of different passes in one file, it's 420 megabytes. So this is going to take forever for After Effects to load. So you'll drop it into your timeline and then it'll just be frozen in place while it's trying to load this up. And sometimes it takes roughly around 10 minutes for it to load. So the best thing to do, instead of rendering everything to one file, you can do it to multiple files. So when we switch over to Blender, we can just go over to our compositing window. We'll add a file output node. So over on the right, just make sure this node tab is selected, and we can rename this render passes, and we can set this up as an OpenEXR, RGB alpha, full float, zip compression. We can override the color space, but I'm just going to do follow scene. These are our inputs, and our inputs are going to come from the render layers node. And here you can see we have all our different render passes. So the first thing we want to do is the combined layer. So that's our image. We'll plug that in. Just make sure that's selected, and we'll rename this combined. And we'll add 3 more nodes, and I'll just rename this one alpha. This will be mist, and then this one will be shadow. So we'll take our render passes and plug them into the corresponding inputs. And I forgot to add one more for ambient occlusion. We'll save our project. We'll specify what folder we want this to go into, and we can either do that here or here. So we'll click on the folder. We'll go into 002, hit accept. We'll save our project. We'll hit render, and once the render's done, all our passes are going to be in that folder. So we'll hit render and wait for this to finish. So our render is complete, and if we navigate to our folder 002, you can see it created a new folder, and we have all our different render passes in here. So we have the alpha, ambient occlusion, combined, mist, and shadow. And if we look at the file sizes, 397 KB, 35 megabytes. The biggest one is the combined one, which is 53 megabytes, which is still not bad. It's way better than 420. So these shouldn't cause any problems inside of After Effects. So we'll jump over to After Effects, and here I created a render passes folder, and we'll just navigate to our render passes, and we'll just import them into After Effects. I'm going to go to the last frame because that's our reference frame, and I'll drop in the combined, and you see how fast that loaded up. I'm just going to grab our mist and drop that in as well. I'll select both of them and link them to the track. And I'll disable our mist layer for now. I'm going to hit render, and you can see it also renders pretty quickly too. So this is great because it speeds up our workflow, and we can move quickly and not have to worry about waiting for things to load, freezing and crashing After Effects and things like that. So the first thing we need to do here is actually track our footage. That's the first step. So I'm going to disable our combined layer. These markers on the end are our reference frame. So that's the clean plate frame that we exported to use as a reference to design the visual effects element. So the first thing I'm going to do is double click on our footage here. It's going to load it up into the comp window here. I'm going to right click, go to track, and track motion. So I'll zoom in here, and we want to use points that are somewhat near where the main visual effects element is. In this case, it's the hole in the building. So I'm going to track this point here. Then we're going to go over to the tracker tab and make sure I have rotation and scale selected. And I'm also going to track, let's see. So I think I'm going to track this point right here. So we'll see how that works out. So since we're on the last frame, I'm just going to track this backwards. Come on, track. Hurry up. So I'm just going to scrub through this just to make sure that it looks like it's on point. And that's looking pretty good. So our next step is actually to create a null object where we're going to store the tracking data. So we'll just rename that to tracking data. We're going to go over here and edit target, select our null object, hit OK, and then hit apply, and then apply the X and Y data. It's looking like that's tracking pretty well. So we'll go back to our reference frame, which is the last frame. We'll turn on the visual effects element, and we'll link that to the track. So if I hit render, this should stick to the footage pretty well and look like it's integrated with the camera movement. And that's looking really good. Now that we've verified that, so I'll go to the end frame, I'll take the mist layer, and I'll parent that to the track as well. And whatever other elements that come into this comp that we need to track to the camera movement, we're always going to link that to the tracking data. So we have to do a little bit more to integrate this into the scene. Not much because it's already looking pretty good, but there's certain things that we have to do, like adjust the color. So first step, I'm just going to add a lumetri effect. And one of the things I'm noticing is that it's a little too saturated compared to the rest of the footage. So I'll go into our basic color correction, go to saturation, and I'll drop it to 93. And that roughly brings it into the saturation that we want. And then I'm also going to change the color of the green. It's a little more blue than the rest of the foliage. So we'll just go to curves, and we'll go to hue versus hue, and we'll sample the green, and then I'll just play around with this until I get the color that I want. Now I'm looking at this and I'm seeing that there are certain areas here, like this green here, it's not catching. So I'm just going to grab this and just pull it out just a little bit more, and also this one just a little bit, enough to grab all the green that we need. Now I can take this and I can just nudge it toward a more yellow. I think that's good. And then I'm also noticing that it might still be a little too yellow up here. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pull this back just a little bit. And I'm going to turn on motion blur so that when this moves, it has the correct amount of motion blur. One of the things with motion blur is you want to go into the advanced tab, make sure this phase is set to -90 and your samples are at least 16 and your shutter angle is 180 degrees. So we're going to have to take the building out of the background here. So this section of the building and this section, and this is in our raw footage, so we're going to have to take that out. So the next thing we have to do is open our clean plate in Photoshop, because we actually have to take out the building in areas that it's visible. So we'll open our clean plate in Photoshop and we'll just unlock the background layer, and I'll just make a duplicate by hitting Control J, and we'll just disable that. So I'll come over here and I'll just take out this section of the building. Okay, so then I'm just going to go over to Edit and then Content Aware Fill. Hit OK. And then we want to pick the areas that we want to pull the fill information from. So here, I'm just going to select the sky here. And I'm actually going to take out the building because we don't want to pull from the building. So that's good. And we can see our preview here. It looks like that's just being replaced with sky element. So that's good. I'm going to hit Apply. And it's looking pretty good, so I'm going to hit OK. I'm going to get rid of that mask. We'll take a look at it, and it looks pretty good. So this is going to be our sky replacement, sky extend. And I'm going to save this, and I'll just make the sky extension version 2. So we're going to switch back to After Effects and import this. So make a new folder. I'll name it PSD tutorial. And so we'll import this Photoshop file. We want to import it as a composition with editable layer styles, so hit OK. So we'll open up that comp and we'll grab the top layer. The top layer is this. I'm going to go into our latest comp. I'm going to paste this in here. Now I'm going to go to our reference frame and I'm going to link this to the track, and I'll drop this below the CG element. So now you can see that the sky is in there, and if I turn the sky layer on and off, you can see what we're taking out. So I think that's looking really good. I mean, it blends really well. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to turn on motion blur for that layer and then motion blur for our CG layer. I'm going to hit render just so we can preview this and see what this looks like. And I think that's looking pretty good. Now over here on the edges, I'm really more concerned about this edge here. We can kind of see the building peeking out from behind the ivy. And that's probably because we didn't extend it far enough. But what we can do is just come into our combined layer, which is our CG element. So this is what we're looking at, and we can just increase the scale slightly. So we can do 101, and because it's linked to the track, that shouldn't really be a problem. So if I unsolo this, you can see here, so that slightly extends over the edge, and also there's not as much of a gap here now. Now we're going to take care of this later, and essentially we could even come in here and just do it in here, so we could make this like 104 or something, and that should work. So that'll cover up that edge. So we can do it that way, or we can pre-comp the whole thing and zoom in on the whole shot. But I think this is fine. I think this will work. We might be able to get away with 103, but that's kind of pushing it. But that works. Yeah, that works. So I think let's stick with 103 because I don't want to make it too big. And if we just play this, we can see that the track is still locked on there. So that's fine. So I've gone ahead and added a color correction layer, and so we'll just play around with the contrast here. So let's see, I'll do a curve, and that's looking pretty good. And then we'll play around with the saturation. I think it's a little too saturated, so I'm just going to knock it down. I'm just trying -10. -10 works for me. I like that. I think that looks good. So another thing we can do here is add a glow layer. This is going to help us blend the CG element into the shot better, because we're going to get some bleed from the original footage, and it's going to overlap the CG element, and that's going to help it blend into the shot a little bit better. So we'll start off with a tight glow. You can see the settings. It's threshold 80, glow radius 12, so that's a very tight glow. And if I turn that on and off, you can see what that's doing. So that's a very tight glow, and the intensity is very low. It's 0.1. So that just kind of bumps it up just a little bit, and it gives us around, especially around edges, it gives us a very tight radius around there. So there's a little bit of spill. The larger glow, which is set here at threshold 90%, the radius is 248 and the intensity is 0.1. So if I turn that on, you can see that there's even more bleed onto the footage, and it's sort of lighting this up, and there's a little bit of that color that kind of spills onto the CG element. So that just helps with integrating it into the scene here. And I'm going to go back to my color correction layer. I'm going to adjust these highlights just a little bit because it's looking like it's getting a little too blown out. That's looking a little bit better. I'm going to pull back a little bit more so we have more of that blue in the sky. And then if I turn our glow layer on and off, you can see the effect that that's having. That just helps the CG element blend into the original footage a little bit better. And then on top of this, I'm going to add a grain layer with some softening. I'm going to use Film Convert for this. We'll just look at the settings, and basically it's just grain at 80% with a 35mm Academy size setting for the grain, and also a softness. So if I punch in a little bit, we can see what this is doing. So if I turn this on and off, we can see that it knocks down the sharpness just a little bit. It's adding grain on top of it, and that's kind of helping it blend all together because CG elements are pretty sharp and perfect. So we want to add all of these artifacts to the scene so that we can get a more natural looking shot and help blend the CG into the shot more. And then adding a unifying grain over the entire image kind of ties everything together. Now we can say that we're done here, but one other thing that we can do if we wanted to is add a mist over the entire thing. So if we just enable our mist pass, we can see here that if I just turn it up to 100%, we can see what it's doing. It's on screen right now. If I turn it to normal, it's just going to take over the entire image. Now remember, this is linked to the track, so it's going to move with the shot. So I'll switch it back to screen so we can get a little bit of that mist kind of effect and still see our shot. But I'm going to drop it down to about 20% opacity. And so we are still getting the mist. One of the issues though is that this area here is actually about the same distance as this, so it would have that kind of opacity, but the level of the opacity of the mist is different here, so we actually have to adjust that. One of the things that we can do is actually take this and just cut a mask. So I'm just going to cut a mask off around here, and I'll switch that to subtract, and then just give it a really heavy feather, like 400. And one of the things I also want to do is just kind of pull this mask a little bit closer so it's not blowing out the sky. And the reason why I put a mask here is because this stuff here in the background, stuff in the far background where there would be a mist, but this is in the foreground, so we don't want the mist on this element. We can also add some other things here like smoke elements from Rampant Design. So I think this is a pretty decent one. Now the problem is that if we just switch this to screen, we'll drop the opacity a little bit. And if we place it in here, it's just kind of overlaid onto the image. So I'm just going to bring up the opacity just to kind of make the point here. But let's say we're at 65% opacity. We need a depth matte in order for certain things to be behind the mist and then certain things to be in front of this mist or smoke that's coming out of the hole in the building here. So I'm just going to duplicate our mist pass and I'm going to solo it. I'm going to bring up the opacity all the way and then switch it back to normal. And I'm also going to get rid of the mask that's on there. So now we just have this black and white image that we can use as a matte. So this is actually good. So we can just add a levels adjustment here. I'll just move this over and we can tighten this up. And if we increase the contrast, especially in the white areas, we can see that we're creating this line. And if we want the smoke to be coming out of this area, we want to tighten this up a little bit. So maybe put it around there and then increase our black level, or decrease the black level so that we're kind of creating this tighter matte here. Then we can use this as a luma matte for the smoke. So in the latest version of After Effects, you actually don't need to place your matte layer on top anymore. We can actually use that as a matte and just link it that way, and that's actually pretty cool. I'm actually going to take the smoke layer and put it underneath the mist, but on top of our CG element. And we're still not getting that depth composite that we want. That's because it's on the alpha matte. So we want to switch this to Luma. So we'll just click here. And now you can see that it looks like it's behind these elements. So that's really cool. Now I can turn the opacity down, blend this in a little bit more. And we kind of have that effect that it's behind these elements, but in front of these elements in the background. Then finally, what we want to do is we want to take the smoke layer and link it to the track so that it moves with our handheld camera movement. So instead of using screen, I went ahead and actually switched this back to normal, and I'm using Video Copilot Color Vibrance, which is a free plugin. Now, if I turn this off, we can see that there's that black, because it's smoke over black. So basically, if we just use Matte Alpha and we turn that on, it gets rid of the black but keeps the smoke. And I'm just going to add a tint effect here because what's happening is if I didn't have that, you can kind of see that there's a little bit of like a bluish tint to the smoke that's there. Might be a little hard to see in the screen recording, but it's there. So I'm going to turn on the tint so that it's just pure black and white, or in this case, just white smoke. And then I'm going to render that out and we can preview it. I also turned down the opacity from 45% to 25% because I just thought it was a little bit too strong. And that's looking pretty cool. Now, another thing we can do is actually just after we tint it, and we apply the color vibrance effect, we can actually tint it again to black, and then we can just turn up the opacity here, and now we have a black smoke coming out of the building if we wanted to do that. So I'm not going to do that, but I'm going to change it to 35%, and then that's an option that we have in order to add smoke coming out of the building here. These are other options that you have and things that you can do with the mist pass. But for this final render, I'm not going to include any of the mist or the smoke coming out of the building because I just kind of want it to be this type of day without any mist or fog or anything like that. And I want the building to appear like it's been abandoned, not that there's a fire inside and it's burning. So that's it for this tutorial. Stay tuned for the next one where we'll be talking about editing, more specifically promo editing, which is how I make my living. And even more specifically, I'm going to talk about some of the promos that I did for Sing 2. I'll be walking through step by step of what it's like on the first day, what are some of the things that you get, like a paper edit from the producers, what's expected of you, what you should bring to the table, and what I did once I saw what the paper edit looked like versus what the final edit should be. So that's going to be really awesome. I hope you guys tune in for that. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. It really helps me so that I can bring you guys more of these types of videos. If you have any questions, hit me up on social or email me at paul@pauldv.net. All the links are in the description. Until next time, my name is Paul Vecchio, and I'll see you on the next one.